Adab and greetings to everyone who has joined this session of the Lahore Literary Festival. And I'd like to, on behalf of the festival, uh, uh, invite Victoria Schofield to talk about her book, The Fragrance of Tears, My Friendship with Benazir Bhutto. And here is the book. So can everyone hopefully see it? So, Victoria, you met Benazir at Oxford. And in fact, you were both at the same college, but you met her at the Oxford Union. And after graduating from Oxford, which was in 76, she joined St. Cat's for the Foreign Service program. And in 77, she became the president of the Oxford Union. And in fact, you followed her. So there was that friendship beginning at Oxford and then which moved on into other years. But I think what I'd like to do at this stage is to talk to you about the friendship that started in Oxford, which you referred to as your salad days. So there you were slogging away, as well as partying, having fun, wearing your Anna Belinda dresses, and getting prepared for your life for the future. And indeed, reading your book, I was sort of reminded of the philosopher Derrida's lectures on friendship, and where he says that in the intimacy of friendship, there is the sensation of recognizing oneself in the eyes of another. So there you were, these two LMH undergrads meeting in the union. And in fact, that's where your friendship is consolidated. So if you could tell us a little bit about those days.
Well, firstly, I'd like to thank you, Chini, very much for being in conversation with me. And I'd like to thank everyone who's listening right now, and indeed the Lahore Literary Festival and all my friends over in Pakistan for listening to me and giving me this opportunity to talk about the book and indeed my friendship. I think when you go to university, young one's worried about what one's studying and whether that's the correct subject to be studying, and you tend to underestimate that actually it's not what you study that might influence your life, but the people you might meet. And of course, when I went up to Oxford in 1974, I had no idea that I would meet Benazir Bhutto. I'm afraid I was desperately ignorant about Pakistan, as I annoyingly used to tell my parents whenever they'd ask me about a bit of history. I haven't studied that bit, and I wasn't studying that bit. We didn't study partition at school, and I certainly hadn't learned very much since then. You know, history was somewhat linear in the 1970s, and so I was really remarkably ignorant, actually, about India, Pakistan, and what was going on there. And then large as life loomed this extraordinary woman who I was introduced to within days of arriving at Oxford, when I actually went to see whether or not I would join the Oxford Union. And again, it's strange sometimes, you don't necessarily always remember in life when you first met people. You somehow know you've met them, but you can't remember exactly when. But in Benazir's case, I do remember, I can still see the visage of her, the image of her standing in this very crowded room in the Oxford Union. And I'm afraid the person who actually introduced us has been consigned to history, because I can't remember who that was, but somebody was saying, you're in LMH, Lady Margaret Hall, aren't you? So is Benazir Bhutto, you must meet her, or words to that effect, as I've described in the book. And there was this tall woman she had at that time long dark hair, and with a slight intonation, an American intonation, because of course she'd spent 4 years in Harvard, smiling and being just very open. And her excitement at, oh, you're in my college, was sort of in a way how it began. So we had the double link. We were in Lady Margaret Hall together, but then I did join the Oxford Union and I got involved in Oxford Union politics. And one has to, again, put this at the period we're talking about, which was the 1970s, mid-1970s. There weren't actually that many women involved in Oxford Union politics. There was some, but there weren't that many, because women had only been allowed into the actual debating chamber relatively recently. For example, Margaret Thatcher, Prime Minister, unbelievably, she was at Somerville, but she was never allowed to be into the main hall of the debating chamber. And so Benazir and I, that's how it began. We just got friendly. Well, I liked her, and I thought she was interesting and charismatic. And as I say, you think about sort of average student, we were all rather boring. And there was this very charismatic, very likable person in our midst, very generous, generosity of spirit, always interested, and not actually, I have to say, I mean, yes, she was the Prime Minister of Pakistan's daughter at the time, but that didn't necessarily sort of weigh very heavily. We weren't particularly aware of that. We just got on and did what we did at Oxford and had a lovely time. It was our salad days. She herself has written about it being the happiest period in her life.
So, in fact, for people who are listening and watching, Victoria has very kindly shared some she has shared some photographs, and we have a PowerPoint which we're going to share with you. And so Victoria is going to talk to them. So this is Victoria when she wins the election as the president of the Oxford Union, with Benazir celebrating with her. So Victoria, would you like to talk to that image, please?
Well, that photograph was actually taken soon after I'd won. I think it was a journalist from the Daily Express had come to talk to us, and we were sitting in the president's office. But what I think that, to me, that photograph encapsulates as a memory is the two of us sitting side by side. How thrilled Benazir was when I won presidency of the Oxford Union. It would have been too easy for another person to think, I'm going to retain the status of being the last woman president, because she was the third. There had only been two previous presidents before our time, female presidents. But not a bit of it. She was so encouraging, so enthusiastic for me to stand, and so thrilled when I won. And again, I think that says something about Benazir and that generosity of spirit, that she loved other people's success as much as her own, and that characteristic remained throughout her life. She was always thrilled to know about people's achievements, and so that's what that photograph represents for me. I mean, two people just, you know, very, very happily sitting side by side, still as students, before the beginning of the more difficult period of her life.
I just got a message saying that the full screen was not coming on. So can you hear me, Victoria? And did the full screen come on for you?
Yes.
So, and of course, I'm going to share the screen again. And here is your term card. So if you could tell us a little bit about the kind of debates that were happening and what Benazir was talking about, because she has later referred to, in fact, the Oxford years as a good sort of training ground in getting prepared to meet deadlines, to face challenges, etc.
Well,
so
that's true. I mean, looking at our term cards now, I mean, a term card, for those of you not quite familiar with the Oxford Union procedure, was the card of debates which you were going to organize during your term. We were each president for one term. Benazir was president in the Hillary term, and I followed her in the Trinity term. And you can see they're actually quite modest. Nowadays, they've turned into pamphlets, but in our day, everything was rather done on a shoestring. Benazir made a particular point of having hers in green and white to represent the colors of the Pakistani flag. And you can see that very clearly there. Mine was a little sketch I'd done of our college, Lady Margaret Hall, and you can just see under the building is the sign LMH. And so I designed that. So we had great fun designing our term cards, but within the body of the card would be the debates. And Benazir at that time, she was a member of the Labour Party. She fitted in both sort of left and right. I mean, her background, it wasn't as obvious as it might be if she'd been someone from Britain, because she moved easily in all circles, really. But she was very concerned with issues about, as we used to call it in the old days, the third world. And I remember one of her debates was that the West can no longer live at the expense of the third world. Also, she had a motion that capitalism will triumph, and she asked Tariq Ali to oppose that motion, and it was defeated overwhelmingly. So there was a social conscience among the debates she chose. And I think the idea is, especially for undergraduates, that you have to learn to speak to the subject, whether or not you believe in it, but you have to be able to see the opposing viewpoint. And I think this is something very important as we look at the freedom of speech today, that you might not like what your opponent is saying, but you do actually have to listen to them. And this was the lesson and the important training that we had in the Oxford Union, which again exists to this day in the House of Commons. I mean, the Oxford Union's modeled on the House of Commons with the dispatch boxes. And I think it was a very important training for Benazir, fitting that in along with her studies. And this is what she's referring to, because you had to have your essay written, you had to do this, then you were doing the union. So it was a question of organization. And I think for her, and certainly also for myself, it was a very useful lesson in being efficient, because you couldn't, for example, not be there. If you were president of the union, you needed to be there, you needed to greet your guests, you needed to be on time. And so it was really a fantastic opportunity. And I think anyone who's been president of the union will agree that it's something that's with you for life. It's a hugely privileged position to have held at one point in time in one's life. Jeannie, you're mute.
Unmuted.
Oh, right now, thank you.
No?
Good.
No.
I couldn't hear you before.
Oh, sorry. So going back and sort of staying with Oxford for a bit. So during this time, of course, she met your family, she met your parents, you're from a naval family, and you have no idea at this time how your life is going to change because of Benazir, and indeed how her life is going to change. Because when she's at Oxford, she is actually wanting to join the Pakistan Foreign Service, and she wants to be a diplomat, and that's how she sees her future. And when she goes back to Pakistan, indeed, she's thrown into a different kind of politics because of what is happening to her beloved father. And indeed, if you could tell us a little bit about this, because she sends you a postcard in December.
It's in December 1977. Yeah, well, I think I probably get it in the new year. It's a Happy New Year postcard, which is after the military coup, because I think the dramatic change of circumstances for her life came literally within days of her return to Pakistan. I went to say goodbye to her in her room at St. Cat's in June, at the end of June 1977. And as we all know, the military coup took place on the 5th of July, 1977. Right. So it was really, came very quickly after her return to Pakistan. And so the next 6 months she'd spent politicking because elections were called. And then, of course, as we know, they were cancelled. And this was during this period, she had her first period of house arrest. And that's, again, I mean, one of the things I think that's so marvelous about this postcard, and of course I kept it, was that it shows a sense of humor, because you could just see the way she's written. I'm confined to house, as some people think I am a danger to, quotes, human life and property, exclamation mark. And then Happy New Year to you and your lovely parents. I mean, it's just, again, you can see the warmth of humanity, which comes from that postcard. But of course, the situation after that got even worse, because in March 1978, her father was actually condemned to death, having been put on trial for conspiracy to murder. And this is the most awful period. I think if you think 1 year back from when we were in the Oxford Union the following year, who would have known the following year she would be going through all this and having her father condemned to death. And it was really that judgment, which I remember seeing. I was absolutely horrified. I saw it on the billboards, Bhutto to hang. You know, in the old days, they used to have the billboards of the newspapers. And I remember just thinking, this isn't true. It just seemed so peculiar. And soon after that, I got this letter where she'd written saying, you know, if you wanted to come and write some articles. She was very keen that what was going on should be known internationally. And of course, you had the international press, they were reporting on it. But it was just one of those impulses I think you do when you're young. I just thought, I said to my parents, you know, I must go. I wanted to go and be some sort of help, but some sort of emotional support. I think, you know, if you try and dissect my motives at the time, it was very, very much on impulse. I didn't know how long I would go. I thought maybe the appeal would last 4 or 5 weeks. I think that was the general idea. And she was keen that others might come out as well, maybe people who were lawyers, because I was not a lawyer. I'd read history at Oxford. But it was just sort of to keep this groundswell of international interest in what was going on in Pakistan through the judicial process. And that essentially is sort of the next phase in a way of the friendship. And it changed the friendship from just being an Oxford friendship to one where I was actually stepping out of my comfort zone. She'd stepped out of her comfort zone, obviously, to come to Harvard, to come to Oxford. It was a different society, different culture, different expectations, different form of dress. But then this was it in a way in reverse, that I decided to go. And I certainly was, again, I would say very unprepared. I didn't really know what I was stepping into. We were not, I think, I would say we collectively in the West were not as culturally aware and as sensitive as we are now to Islamic traditions. So I was not particularly aware about forms of dress. Very quickly on arrival, I realized that the short skirts and t-shirts I'd bought were rather inappropriate. And Benazir very sweetly immediately gave me some of her shalwar kameez to wear. And I automatically felt much better. I didn't sort of stick out like a sore thumb as a foreigner who just arrived. And that was really how it began. But it was a really painful year. And watching her pain, yes, I had a ringside view, but of course I got drawn into the emotion of it because it was just so tragic. And here was my friend, somebody I'd known very well, having to endure really something that, as she herself said, fact was stranger than fiction. You couldn't really script it if you thought about writing a novel.
So in fact, Victoria, you say that you had a ringside view. You were in fact part of what was happening. So if you, would tell us that, you were there for 11 months in Pakistan, actually almost a year. And you were first staying with the wonderful Dr. Niazi and his family, and where through your friendship with Benazir, you made another friendship with his daughter Yasmin, and of course with Amna Paracha, Samia Wahid, Benazir's friends. And you were doing the accounts for Begum Bhutto, and you were also, in fact, the stenographer to the lawyers, with your touch typing skills. And even more than that, you were actually in direct contact with Mr. Bhutto. So first, tell us a little bit about, this English rose, sheltered, living in Henley-upon-Thames, born into a naval family, has been to Oxford and is then thrown into, because of her friendship, to Pakistan. She knows nothing about it. She arrives over there and she's with a family who are under surveillance. She is the friend of Benazir Bhutto, whose father is in prison and with the death sentence hanging over his head. So you are also surveilled. And just so tell us a little bit about, or in fact, more than a little bit about what happened to you when you're staying with the Niazis. Dr. Niazi is surveilled, and then you have the Chilean diplomat, Gustavus Tora, who supported Allende and doesn't like the men on horseback and military dictators. So you're able to move from that one house to another. So tell us about all of that, because you're part of it. You're not just on the Ringside.
Well, I do feel I'm very much on the Ringside, because it was not my father, and it was my friend's father, Chini, but it sort of evolved and developed my presence, because firstly, when I arrived, Benazir was under house arrest. I was given permission to stay with her briefly, and then they said, no, you can't stay anymore. So then I went back up to Rawalpindi to attend the appeal in the Supreme Court, because the idea was that I would get a journalist pass and be able to go into the appeal. This was the idea, and then maybe I would write some articles. That was the original idea. And I was very fortunate that the then editor of The Spectator, which is our weekly journal, very well-known political journal, gave me accreditation. I'm not quite sure why he was so generous, because it was quite unusual. And I got a famous letter of accreditation to be, I think it said, offered every assistance once I was in Pakistan. And this was absolutely crucial, because without that, I wouldn't have got my pass into the Supreme Court of Pakistan. And incidentally, what we're looking at now are my little sketches of the judges. Because again, in those days, one has to realize there were no digital cameras or no mobile phones where you could suddenly take a quick photograph. And I thought also for my parents, it would be interesting to see what the judges looked like. So I did sit and draw these, the little sketches of the judges, as well as taking notes and trying to understand the appeal, which, as I say, I wasn't a lawyer. It meant learning up what had happened in the trial. And the defense lawyers were very helpful in providing me with the documents so that I could understand what actually the appeal was doing. But one of the things which is true is that I was a really good typist, because my father was retired from the Navy, and he wrote naval history, and he and my mother used to sit in a study at our home and type, and I grew up to the sound of the manual typewriter. And so this was something that I realized very quickly, because again, one has to go back to how handwritten everything was in those days, and how very difficult. I mean, no laptops, no computers, none of this. And so I did used to type. I certainly wasn't the stenographer. I mean, they had lawyers, they had typists, they had all sorts of things, but very, very private things from Mr. Bhutto. I did type, and Benazir asked me to type, and we would work on together. And I think the most important piece of work that we did work on was the rebuttal to the white papers, which Zulfikar Bhutto wrote under great difficulty in jail. As I say, you have, I obviously I never went in there, but it was not at all equipped with all the accoutrements you might want to be writing. And the pages used to come out, and I would type them from his handwriting, and then I would send them back so he could correct. And we worked on this. And this is the document which then became published and is very well known now, of course, because the publishers took the title, a quotation from what Mr. Bhutto had written, "If I'm Assassinated," and this was the book. And so this was the sort of practical help that I could give to Benazir, because I certainly wasn't there for a holiday. I was there to try and help her in whatever way happened. And so it evolved. It also evolved that the lawyers were staying in Flashman's Hotel, somebody trustworthy. I did I reconciled the accounts, the bills. They were all working pro bono, but nonetheless, certain things had to be paid for. And so it just all evolved, in addition to which, to be spending a lot more time than I had originally anticipated. But somehow, once I was there, the momentum was there. I wasn't going to say, well, I've spent here 4 weeks, I'm going home now. I mean, it just wasn't on. I was there sort of for the duration, and I stayed for the duration through thick and thin, despite the surveillance and all the rest of it. until after Mr. Bhutto's execution on 4th April 1979.
So again, going back to how your own life changed and, you know, what you experienced in the tragic politics of Pakistan, you know, some of the darkest times in our history. And you were driving from Islamabad to Flashman's, and one day you were quite tired and you didn't really want to go. And you got a call. The lawyers wanted you to come over. You spoke to Yahya Bakhtiar, and he said, "Oh, it's all right, Victoria. If you don't want to come over, could you read from us what happened then?"
Yes, I've got the book here. I hope you can all hear as I read. Just recapping a little bit on what you said, Jeannie. Fridays were normally days of rest, equivalent to our Sundays. And Friday 9th of March appeared to be like any other. Yahya Bakhtiar had told me not to come into Rawalpindi because they didn't need me. I was relieved because I was tired and glad to have a day to myself. Around lunchtime, Bakhtiar's driver Iqbal, noted for his military posture and handlebar moustache, arrived at the kitchen door. He spoke only Punjabi, and so our conversation was always monosyllabic. "Bakhtiar Saab," he gestured in the direction of Rawalpindi. My heart sank. "Are you sure?" I asked him. He repeated again affirmatively, "Bakhtiar Saab." Since I didn't want to spend 45 minutes going to Rawalpindi unnecessarily, I motioned to Iqbal to wait while I spoke to Bakhtiar on the phone to make sure that he did need me. "Victoria, hello. No, it's fine. You take rest." "No, wait, Mr. Memon is saying something to me." "Hold on." Ghulam Ali Memon then came on the line. "Ah, Victoria, I know you are tired. The position is that we're all tired. But yes, I would like you to come." I set aside my own fatigue and got in the car to go to Rawalpindi. When I arrived, Memon was sitting with another young lawyer, Salim Khan. "So you're tired," he said to me again. I nodded. "Yes, I understand, but I'm glad that you have come." Since Memon knew all the legal aspects of the case, he was the most competent person to write the final epitaph to what would be Yahya Bakhtiar's concluding remarks, and it was this document he wanted me to type while he dictated. I sat down at the typewriter. Salim sat near Memon, ready to hand him any reference books he required. After half an hour, the sentences he was dictating came more slowly, and I looked up, my fingers poised over the keys, waiting. Memon's face had the most awful expression, and he was struggling to speak. Suddenly, he cried out, "Allahu Akbar, God is great," and fell sideways on the sofa where he'd been sitting. Both Salim and I were horrified. While he immediately picked up the telephone to call a doctor, I rushed to the next door room to alert Bakhtiar. Despite the seriousness of the situation, I remember being frightened that Bakhtiar might be annoyed at being disturbed during his afternoon rest. "Mr. Bakhtiar," I called, knocking furiously. "Come quickly, it's Mr. Memon." Bakhtiar immediately followed me out of his room. In my brief absence, Memon's face had become contorted, and he was groaning. What it transpired was his last breath. He'd had a massive heart attack. I had never seen anyone die before, and the shock was appalling. I couldn't imagine what Benazir would feel at losing such an important member of her father's legal team at this critical time, when her father's life was perilously close to being taken from him. Yet again, my first thought was to get a note to her so that she was forewarned when the news came on the BBC. Since Memon was from Karachi, his body had to be flown immediately to his hometown. The lawyers would accompany it, and so I found myself booking air tickets for several lawyers and a coffin.
Yeah, thank you for that reading. And it's, you know, in the larger tragedy of what is happening to the country, to the Bhutto family, to your beloved friend, and indeed to Mr. Memon and his family and his colleagues. I mean, it's just cataclysmic. And of course, for you, as this young woman you're confronted with death for the first time. Did you at that stage ever think, because I'm going back to what Derrida says about friendship, because one of the things that your book did for me was to take me back to Derrida on the politics of friendship. So he says that the moment we befriend someone, we are already preparing for the possibility that we might outlive them, or they us. So did you have any idea that, did it ever cross your mind that, the tragedy that keeps unfolding and seems to be unending, did it ever strike you at that moment?
No, I've got to say it didn't, Jeannie. I didn't know what I did expect. I mean, and it's interesting when you look back on your life, and now we know, when one's looking in retrospect, one knows what's happened. But at the time, I didn't. And even at the time we're talking about, I didn't anticipate that Mr. Bhutto would be executed. I suppose this episode with Mr. Memon happened on March 9th, less than a month after Mr. Bhutto was actually executed. So that's the time frame. I mean, events move very quickly from then on. And I suppose it's true to say by that stage, well, we were working on the review petition. Once the review petition was rejected at the end of March, I mean, within days he was executed. So then the reality began to strike. But in terms of Benazir, and fast forwarding a little bit, we actually sort of thought we'd grow old together, and we didn't. I didn't think, well, whether she'd go before me or me before her. I really didn't think. I think it's quite difficult to look into the crystal ball like that. But certainly, I think that what one does learn from this experience is how transient life is, and how fortunes can change and change again, and to profit and benefit from every aspect that you do have, because you absolutely never know what might happen, and particularly in an environment like Pakistan.
So I'm going to share the screen again for the viewers and listeners. So here is a sketch. Can you see the whole screen?
Yep, I can see.
So that's a sketch that you did of Mr. Bhutto in the courtroom. There's that very poignant moment in the courtroom where he actually sees that you're there, and I think it's Mr. Bakhtiar that he actually manages to say hello to you. Could you tell us a little bit about that?
Well, partly, I mean, it was to do with the way the appeal was being run, because Mr. Bhutto had no confidence in his trial in the Lahore High Court. Consequently, he hadn't presented any defense witnesses. Mr. Bakhtiar had put in a request for him to be able to appear and present his defense in the Supreme Court of Pakistan. And this was in December 1978, just to get the context right. And I had been in Pakistan for all those months before that, and typing the documents and everything. And it was this extraordinary sensation of having worked for somebody I'd actually never met, transmitting notes and transmitting back the retyped documents, etc. And so the first day that he appeared, I was with another journalist, the Guardian journalist, Peter Nieswand, and we determined to get what we called good seats in the Supreme Court so that we could be in the front and actually see, rather than being stuck in the back and not see what was going on. And so needless to say, because I'd drawn the judges, I thought I would try and see what I could do, how close I could get, if I could just do a little sketch of Mr. Bhutto, because again, no photographs were allowed, no mobile phones being able to take pictures. And again, I wanted to record the moment. And so that's why I drew this little amateur sketch of him. But towards the end of that first morning, I was nearby, and I did notice Mr. Bakhtiar sort of saying something to Mr. Bhutto, and then suddenly over the podium where he was standing, he leaned out and put his hand to shake my hand. And again, it was just incredibly moving. And Mr. Bakhtiar subsequently said to me, yes, he wanted to thank you for the work you've done for him. So that's the background to the sketches and his appearance. And he came to the Supreme Court for 3 more days after that. And then we never saw him again, and nobody apart from his close family, his lawyers and the prison guards saw him again. And that is one of the notes that you can see here that he wrote to me in the early days. I'd written to him to tell him that I'd arrived and that I was going to try and see Benazir. She was in Karachi under house arrest at that time. It's the 12th of June, 1978. And you can see what he's written there. How can I thank you enough? Only in such conditions is it possible to appreciate the goodness of the few. And I've kept that letter all these years. It's in my files because that was sort of the beginnings of the contact and the notes that I had with him.
So yes, that's also you, the archivist and the historian, keeping your notes and keeping the record. You've then, of course, written about the street fighting years. And if you could tell us a little bit about Benazir's time after Mr. Bhutto passed away, and also the terrible physical hardships that she had to endure. So there you are with Samia Wahid, Begum Bhutto and Fakhri, her niece, and of course surrounded by the police. And just tell us a little bit about, apart from the grief, the physical hardships that Benazir had to face.
Well, I mean, they were tremendous, and there were times when one wondered how she managed to keep going. This photograph actually is taken in June 78. This is when she's just been allowed out of house arrest. She's had this ear problem, which does trouble her continuously. And so she goes into hospital in Karachi, and Begum Bhutto, who herself is under house arrest, is allowed to come and see her. And that's why there are so many police. And that's her cousin, Fakhri, we see on the picture as well. That was sort of in the way, the beginnings. You can't underestimate if you're in house arrest and in jail, your health inevitably deteriorates. But I think the worst period for Benazir occurred subsequently after her father's execution. I, meanwhile, had to go back to the UK. I really I'd done everything I felt I could do. She was under arrest, and we exchanged notes, and she realized I must go back and just get a job and do some work and get on with things. But then, of course, the situation went really from bad to worse for her in Pakistan, and she was briefly for a while freed. But then with the beginnings of the movement for the restoration of democracy, in March 1981, she was put under arrest. And I think I call it the street fighting years because prior to that, she was incredible. And I was by that stage working at the BBC, reading over the ticker tape her statements that came through, and this defiance against the military dictatorship of General Zia was just extraordinary, her courage and bravery. But inevitably, with the movement for the restoration of democracy, which coincided with the hijacking of the PIA plane, she was put under arrest. And instead of being house arrest, this was the period she was taken to jail, to prison, to Sakar, and in the heat of the summer in Sindh. And when I subsequently asked her about it, it was when she, I mean, just paraphrasing what she said, but she said it was one was living, but one was not living, this isolation that she felt in Sakar and then subsequently under house arrest. And she wasn't freed until January 1984. It was a long period of time. I remember it was very difficult to get notes through to her, but a group of us Oxford friends, we did gather together for her 30th birthday in June 1983. And we reminisced, and we got an article published in the Guardian newspaper by Polly Toynbee, just remembering her. I just hope that somehow if she gets newspapers or something, she'll, she's not been forgotten by her Oxford friends. Because the other thing, Jeannie, I would like to say that, yes, I was the one who was out there, but her Oxford friends in general meant an enormous amount to her. And one of the things that we would always do whenever we chatted was sort of reminisce on what the Oxford friends were doing. And she always took huge interest in who'd got married and who'd had a baby. And when possible, she'd send a wedding present or a present for the baby. And this, again, I think it not just because her life was going along a totally different track. She didn't forget the Oxford friends, nor indeed the Harvard friends. She was very close to all those friends, which again, I think when you're talking about friendship, it shows how formative friendship is during those college days, that somehow it's a bond that whatever you then continue to do, you stay friendly with those people. And it's a great leveler in a way, however high or their achievements are. When you meet again, it's as old friends.
So, of course, she remembered you and your friendship. And I'd asked you just the other day if you could show us the Anna Belinda dress that she had and that you loved, and which she then sent for you. So do you have it with you?
Yes, I've got it just nearby. I'll get it. We all wore these Anna Belinda dresses because, well, if we were lucky enough to, but she lent me this one when we were in Oxford. I don't know if you can all see it now here. And it was a funny thing. Yes, I mean, I didn't quite know, it was just a sweet gesture that she, as we needed these dresses for formal occasions, and she had quite a few, so she lent me this one. And then when another friend had gone to visit her in 1980, Claire Wilmer, she came back, and out of her suitcase, she produced this dress, which Benazir had sent me. I mean, more or less saying, I don't think I'll ever have any need for it now, and so you can have it. And I did wear it. I mean, and I've kept it. I haven't really had the heart to throw it out. It's kept
but very carefully. It's also a full-length dress.
It's a full-length dress. So
it's a long dress. And yeah, it also sort of says something very special about female friendship as well. And of course, according to the old philosophers, females are not capable of friendship. And so it says something very special about the kind of friendship that you have, that you could exchange clothes, etc., and presents. And there's that very touching episode of when she brings you these pearl earrings and sees you wearing something very similar. So perhaps you can tell the audience about that.
Well, that was a lovely episode. Yes. Well, I used to always organize dinner parties or lunch parties or teas or whatever we had time for the Oxford friends. I mean, it was sort of the Oxford friends. And it was easier if I organized it because, she didn't have to. And so I would organize. And sometimes she'd suddenly remember somebody we hadn't seen for ages. And so I'd spend time ringing someone to find out someone who, to get the telephone number and the address. But on this particular occasion, she arrived with a little small box, and it was a tiny little box. And as she handed it to me, she looked sort of pleased, but on the other hand, she looked disappointed because she looked at me. And as I opened it, she saw that I was wearing the identical pair of pearl earrings she was giving to me. But unashamed, not at all sort of set back and always fast to think on her feet. She said, "Oh, you never mind. You have two daughters. And so now you have two pairs of pearl earrings." And it was just a charming aspect of her generosity. So yeah, that was, with everything else, I think, again, we're talking about friendship, Jeannie, but, she had huge responsibilities. And by this stage, she was a political leader. She'd been prime minister. And so one can't underestimate that. And I suppose the juxtaposition is that people who are in important positions, they don't stop being human. They don't stop having the lovely characteristics which they always had as friends.
So we're coming to that now because you, of course, got married and moved to New York, and Benazir came to England. And but Yasmin and her came and stayed with you in New York, where they met your husband. They met Stephen. So, and of course, he's someone that you're going to spend the rest of your life with, and it's important what he thinks about Benazir, your very dear and close friend. So, what was that meeting like when he first met her?
Well, it was actually quite funny in a way, because I think she'd rung me from Washington and she'd said, could she come and stay? And Stephen, of course, he knew all about Benazir, but he'd been at Cambridge, so he didn't know her. We were on those different, you operate, this is what you find with the Oxbridge network. A lot of people know a lot of people, but then through somebody else, but he'd not met her, even during those days. But he knew about her. But when we got married, she was in that terrible period of being under house arrest. And so I think he came home from work one day, and I've written about it in the book. I said to him, guess who's coming to stay? And of course he couldn't guess. So I put him out of his misery and told him immediately. And so of course he said, that's fine. We were sitting having dinner, I think it must have been the first night, with Yasmin and another friend who'd come by. And we talked, and I remember Benazir talking, that wonderful sort of expansive way she had of talking. I mean, quite rapidly, but very, very eruditely, and full of ambition and anticipation and optimism and expectation about what she was going to achieve. And we were mainly listening. And then after we'd all gone to bed that night, Stephen turned to me and he looked me sort of firmly in the eye and said, now I understand. And I took that as a wonderful realization that he understood how important this friendship was and what an amazing person Benazir was.
And then, of course, we know what happened to Zia al-Haq, and we know that Benazir became the first woman to become Prime Minister of Pakistan. And in fact, yesterday, or a few days ago, in Salima Hashmi's conversation with you, the Bloomsbury conversation, Salima Hashmi in fact spoke about how important it was for the women of Pakistan in the context of post-Hadood, post-Zia years, to have Benazir there as not just a symbol, a very real presence of the strength of the women of Pakistan and the struggle that they had to confront, because the powers that be were always against her, were always opposed to her. And so if you could tell us a little bit about that time and the conversations that you might have had with her.
Well, I think one of the things that was just fantastic was that 10 years after, less than 10 years after her father's execution, she became Prime Minister. And it was just a wonderful euphoria. And I think, I say that again, observing, but for Pakistanis, you'd had 11 years of military dictatorship, and then this woman was the Prime Minister, and we'll all remember that fantastic photograph of her in her green shalwar kameez with her white dupatta taking the oath of office. One of the difficulties was that because of the 11 years of military dictatorship, the expectations were so high as to what she could achieve for democracy, for people, for this, for that, that they were unreasonably high, and consequently, she had so much that she needed to achieve. But I think, and so that's why you will get the critics who are saying, well, she didn't achieve enough. But what she did achieve was this feeling, and it was said to me by several people, including Salima Hashmi and including Asma Jahangir, when I interviewed her on the role of women in Pakistan under Benazir, was that she might not be able to achieve everything, but behind her, we can achieve. It's lifted the glass ceiling for us. And I don't think that can be underestimated. During the Zia years, women weren't seen, they weren't on television, there weren't these wonderful chat shows. You see that this has continued, that legacy of hers has continued. These very eloquent women you now see on chat shows on TV and you hear on the radio and all the rest of it. And that was for all aspects, whether it was law or medicine or just sort of social improvement. women felt, I can now do this because we've got this female prime minister. And I don't think that can be underestimated. Again, I don't think we in the Western world realized that achievement, because we thought we've got Margaret Thatcher, Pakistan's got Benazir Bhutto, but we were remarkably ignorant, because we'd had the Iranian Revolution in 1979, but we were remarkably ignorant about the sort of juxtaposition of Islamic society and the role of women in Islamic society. And so I would say from a Western point of view, people didn't really appreciate her achievement of becoming a female prime minister, and going through a pregnancy as prime minister of her second child was, again, extraordinary, and the message that gave to other women. But even at that time, she still had people working against her. I remember seeing one time when she explained to me, you know, so-and-so, don't be surprised, he won't shake my hand, you know, that business, and that men were, you know, the mullahs were preaching in the mosque that you should not have a woman as a prime minister.
Yes.
That's a lovely wedding photograph you're now showing.
Yes. And I loved this photograph of yourself, and I was sort of rather hoping that you'd wear the Anna Belinda dress to the wedding, but
no, I didn't.
Of course, and in the friendship, and in her role as a woman prime minister, and what people like Asma, who was a close friend, were able to do, what people like Salima and other women were able to do. You both are also talking about your children, sharing stories about your children, sharing birthdays, etc. And here is this lovely photograph of Benazir with her children, that Bilawal and Bakhtavar and Asifa, and here are you with Alexandra,
two daughters.
Your two daughters.
And I have a son as well. He was
yes,
not,
well, here you are.
There's the son.
And it's lovely because there's you and Benazir, almost reminiscent of that Oxford photograph, you know, with you on the left and her on the right. And then you've got your children.
Yes.
And you've got your children.
Well, I think one of the things that is really important is how much she absolutely adored being a mother. And again, you know, when you know of somebody as a politician, you might not know, you know, whether they're good mothers or whatever, but she was a fantastic mother, and she absolutely adored those children, and she loved other people's children, and was very, very sweet with my children, would arrive with presents for them, and you know, ask me how they were. And I think this is, again, you know, maybe people don't know that, but she absolutely adored her children. And of course, her premature removal was tragic also, not only for the people of Pakistan, but for the family. But we had some lovely times together with the children playing. And I remember once she said to me, which is why she loved the parties, you know, children remember what they've done on expeditions and excursions with their parents. They don't necessarily remember just being stuck at home. So, you know, we made use of what we could with the time as the children were growing up.
So I've put up a slide of Bilawal at Christchurch with Auntie Victoria on one side and his mother on the other. And this is
to Oxford.
Just a few months before her own departure from the world. And here we are at Bilawal's graduation. And of course, Benazir is not there. I think it's important for you to tell us that you were actually with Benazir when she went back to Pakistan. You joined her, and you were on the bus or the truck when the first assassination attempt took place. So could you tell us a little bit about that? And then and perhaps if you can yes, and then you left, and your last meeting with her.
Well, yes, I mean, this photograph, the previous one you showed of us, we took Bilal October the 2nd, 2007. He had to start at Oxford, and she was incredibly happy that he was going to Oxford because her father had been at Christ Church, and her brother, Mir Murtaza, he'd also been at Christ Church. And she was so excited that he was following in her footsteps, as indeed had her father been excited when she followed in his footsteps. And so that was that very happy period. But 2 weeks later, she was returning to Pakistan, her arrival scheduled for October 18th, I believe. And I went back with her. I traveled on the plane, which was full of all her supporters and lots of journalists. It was a huge media event, traveling from London to Dubai. And then she came on the plane. And I think we changed planes actually in Dubai to go from Dubai to Karachi. And I think it was so moving to go back. Again, part of the jigsaw of her life was this momentous returning home after 8 years of exile, self-imposed exile. She'd felt it was better, especially also for the children, to be living abroad. And I wanted to share in it with her, because that was, again, it was carrying on in the jigsaw of her life, not knowing obviously what the end was going to be or when the end was going to be. And we were on the truck. She was so excited. She was greeting her supporters. What she wanted was to sort of replicate what she'd done in Lahore when she returned to Pakistan in April 1986, was to show the people that she was there, she'd returned. And it was just very, very moving. But unfortunately, Pakistan, as we know, had become a very dangerous place. And after a few hours on the truck, there were the 2 suicide explosions, which killed over 150 people, a tremendous number of people surrounding the truck. And we miraculously escaped unharmed at that point in time. But I suppose now looking back on it, it was a sign that things were more dangerous even than we might have thought. I mean, we did anticipate. She was aware. I talked to her also about security. She talked to many people about security, but I do remember her saying life and death are in God's hands. And that was an expression she used very frequently. And again, I think it displays this tremendous courage of this woman who knew what the dangers were, and yet she was prepared to face them. And as I say, we were lucky first time round, but second time when they attacked her, as we know, they were successful, and she was killed on December 27th. So I'll read the last bit when I see her for the last time, which is I leave Pakistan in October. I stay for a week after the first bomb blast. And then her sister Sanam Sunny and I were going back to London together. Early the following morning, Sunny and I left together for London. We were both crying. I had a heart-wrenching feeling that I would never see Benazir again, and I never did. On 27th of December, she was assassinated after addressing an election rally at Liaquat Bagh in Rawalpindi. And that was it, yeah.
So you then, in fact, didn't go back to Pakistan immediately, but you did go sometime later.
I went the following year in September.
Yes, the following year. Mm-hmm. And when you met Asif, and if you could just read that to us, please.
One evening during my next visit in 2008, I went to see Asif. I'd known him ever since the wedding, but without his wife, I now felt reticent. The Englishwoman, Benazir's friend, whom his children called Auntie. You know, I said tentatively, you can always rely on me to help the children if there's something you need in England. especially while Bilal was at Oxford. There was a pause. I continued somewhat shakily. Of course, I don't want to intrude, but I just wanted you to know I'm always there for them. Asif looked at me intently and then spoke slowly. Yes, of course, you must stay in touch with them. You know they smell her on you. Nearly 2 years later, when I was in Karachi, I determined to go to Gari Khuda Bakhsh to visit Benazir's grave. With the PPP government in power, Asif had become president of Pakistan in succession to Musharraf. Although I could have taken a commercial flight to Saqqa, he'd put the chief minister of Sindh's plane at my disposal. But it developed a technical fault before takeoff, and so I made the journey from Karachi by helicopter. Passing at low altitude over the parched desert of Sindh, we approached the lands watered by the irrigation system of the Indus River, spread out beneath me. Finally, from the helicopter, for the first time, I saw the white domed mausoleum looking like a modern Taj Mahal. As soon as the helicopter landed, I went directly to the mausoleum. On entering, I took off my shoes, relishing the cool of the marble on my hot feet. Passing under an archway, I found myself looking at a gigantic portrait of Benazir. It was not a family birth or death anniversary, when thousands traditionally converged, and so with the exception of some villagers who'd come in from the fields and a few attendants, the mausoleum was empty. When I approached, one of the attendants came forward to offer me a basket of rose petals to scatter. Benazir's grave, covered in red velvet cloth, was next to her father's, which now had an ornate marble canopy. As I grasped a handful of rose petals, I thought again of my first visit to Gari Khuda Bakhsh over 30 years ago, when Benazir and I had stood side by side in the open air by the graves of her ancestors, the triumphs and tragedies of the future as yet unknown. Now she lay with them. The sorrowful smell of the mist lingering over the Indus, gentle waves of rice, dung and rind, 'tis the salt cry of Sindh. As I die, let me feel the fragrance of tears.
Well, there's little one can say after that. I wanted to, in fact, end with another question, but I think there might be people from the audience who want to ask questions. And again, to go back to the philosopher, in your love for the children and your support of Benazir's children, I'll go back to his words that to love friendship, it is not enough to know how to bear the other in mourning. One must also love the future. And of the many desires, he says, that none is comparable to this unequal hope, to the ecstasy towards a future which will go beyond death. And I think that one can only thank you for sharing your grief, the experience of that friendship. And if there are any questions, I think we'll take them now. We have one question from the audience, Victoria. I think that's probably the first one's been answered, that how long did you stay in Pakistan during the trial? And the other one is that how did you balance your own individual self in a world that's completely opposite to yours, because she says that you are a spiritually very strong person. So could you say something about that?
But the balancing of the world, well, I mean, it's actually a difficult question. I probably would need time to reflect on it. I suppose what the lesson from this is how friendship does drive one away from one's own comfort zones and into another zone. It is that strand, and one's very fortunate, I think, in life if you've had a friend or friends where that bond is so strong that it does encourage you to step out of your own comfort zone, your own environment, your own circle. And I feel my life has been hugely enriched by it. I wish the story hadn't been so tragic. And there were many happy moments as well. And that's why it's nice to think about the tea parties and the things that we enjoyed together. I wished it didn't have such a tragic ending, but certainly it's enriched my life because it's given me, I think, huge understanding of an endeavor and of a struggle. And it's given me a huge love of another country, which I would not have got to know so well as I have got to know Pakistan. And I often say that, and I speak from the heart to all the Pakistanis who might be listening now, that when I first went to Pakistan, I knew absolutely nobody except Benazir, who was under house arrest. And, you know, as I say, my parents, because they knew and liked her, gave me their blessing. Off I went with a notebook and a camera because we didn't have any mobile phones or anything, or no emails, no question of just suddenly sending them an email to say I've arrived safely. But the doors have been open to me. And you mentioned the friends, Chini, Yasmin and Samia and Amna. We all, 13 years after her assassination, you know, 40 years after all of this took place, we have remained bound in friendship because of her. And this is what I often found, was that people who'd been friendly with Benazir in their own environments, even the American friends, like Anne Fadiman, Peter Galbraith, we're all very friendly now because of her. And I think it shows what a remarkable woman she was, that she attracted people who have almost, I mean, without any effort, but have wanted to stay in touch because of her. And that's a friendship legacy as well that I don't think one can underestimate. And so, yes, it was a challenge, and life is full of challenges. And if you don't have challenges in life, you know, well, you know, it's pretty tame in a way. But I don't regret for a minute any of the difficulties or the hardships that I might have experienced, because they were minimal compared with what she was experiencing. And certainly my life has been enriched by having known her. And it's one of the reasons why in my acknowledgements, I've thanked her. It's unusual to thank somebody who's no longer with us, but I remain thankful to her and indeed to her family, because they opened such love and affection for me throughout this period.
And there are two questions. I don't want people to feel that they've been missed out, but partly I think they've already been answered. But there's one question that if you could state Benazir's political philosophy in one sentence, what would that be?
In one sentence?
Yes, difficult.
She really wanted to help the poorer people of Pakistan. And anybody who says contrary to that is wrong. She really wanted to make a difference. And when she went back to try and become prime minister for the third time, that was absolutely her goal. And I know that. And that is why it's a tragedy that she was cut down, as I've written, in her prime, because we'll never know what she might have achieved for the people of Pakistan.
And one thing that you took away from her, which will stay with you for the rest of your life?
That bond of friendship, that courage I witnessed, that kindness, that generosity of spirit.
And there's another question, that were you present in Pakistan when the riot erupted in Gaddafi Stadium?
No, I wasn't. That was before I arrived.
Yeah. So I think to go back, just like to end on that slide of The Fragrance of Tears, your book. And thank you, Victoria, on behalf of the Lahore Literary Festival, and of course for talking to me, and thank the audience for being linked in to this event. And I'll share the screen and go to the slide. And we wanted to end with music from Sindh that she loved, and in fact, Alan Fakir singing Shah Abdul Latif, but somehow that link is not working. But we end with the words of Shah Abdul Latif here, and the title from Victoria's book, which is here. So thank you, everyone. Thank you, Victoria. Thank you, the organizers at the LLF, and thank you from the audience.
Thank you, everyone, for listening so much. Thank you.